You're the enemy's son? Alien princess saved human warrior and sparked a war of revenge. Commander Zarin Cade had exactly 3 minutes to live, and he knew it. The wreckage of his stealth fighter burned around him, twisted metal groaning as toxic smoke filled the cockpit. Through the shattered canopy, he could see them coming, Crithian death squads moving through the purple vegetation of Veros Prime like shadows, their scanners sweeping methodically for survivors. His team was dead. All 12 of them, scattered across this hostile alien world in pieces of burning debris. Zarin dragged himself from the cockpit, leaving a trail of crimson blood across the gray metal. His left leg was broken, ribs cracked, and something warm kept pooling in his boot. He had his sidearm with 3 rounds remaining and a combat knife. Not much to show for 15 years of humanity's war against the Crithian Empire, but it would have to be enough for one final stand. The scanners were getting closer. He could hear the electronic pulses, the clicking of Crithian mandibles as they communicated in their harsh language. They never took prisoners. Everyone in the human defense forces knew that. The Crithians believed in total extermination, viewing humanity as a pest infestation spreading across their rightful territory. Zarin propped himself against a boulder, aimed his weapon at the approaching sounds, and waited for the end. Then she appeared. She moved through the alien forest like liquid silver, her form humanoid but distinctly other. Her skin held an opalescent quality that shifted colors with the bioluminescent plants around her, and her eyes were larger than human, colored like amethyst in the dim light. She wore simple clothing, carried a gathering basket filled with strange plants, and she froze when she saw him. For 3 heartbeats, they stared at each other. Zarin kept his weapon trained on her, but his hand trembled. She was clearly one of the Veros, the native species of this planet. Intel had said they were allies of the Crithians, subjects of the Empire for decades. She should be calling for the death squads right now. She should be running. Instead, she did something that made no sense. She set down her basket, pulled out a shimmering cloak from within it, and moved toward him with her hands raised in what might have been a peaceful gesture. Zarin tried to speak, to warn her away, but his words came out as a wet cough. Blood on his lips now. Definitely internal bleeding. The Veros woman moved with sudden purpose. She threw the cloak over him, and the world shimmered. Through the material, Zarin could see out, but he realized he must be invisible from outside. Some kind of advanced camouflage technology. The woman stepped away from him just as the first Crithian patrol emerged from the tree line. What happened next burned itself into Zarin's fading consciousness. The woman spoke to the Crithians in their language, her voice melodic but subservient. She gestured toward a different direction, away from where Zarin lay hidden. The Crithians chittered at her, their insectoid bodies towering over her smaller frame, weapons pointed at her chest. But whatever she said convinced them. They moved on, following her false lead. She returned an hour later, when the forest had fallen silent except for the distant sounds of search parties moving away. She removed the cloak and looked at him with those strange purple eyes. Then she did something even more incomprehensible. She lifted him, impossibly strong for her size, and carried him deeper into the forest. Zarin woke in darkness, lying on something soft. Every part of his body screamed in agony, but he was alive. As his eyes adjusted, he realized he was in a cave, illuminated by glowing fungi that covered the walls. The Veros woman sat nearby, grinding something in a bowl with focused intensity. When she noticed he was awake, she approached with the bowl and gestured for him to drink. He should have refused. It could be poison. It could be some kind of Crithian trap. But Zarin was dying anyway, so he drank. The liquid tasted like bitter flowers and lightning. Within minutes, the pain began to recede and exhaustion pulled him back under. The pattern repeated for days. He would wake, she would feed him her medicines, and he would sleep. Gradually, his body began to heal with a speed that should have been impossible. Whatever was in her concoctions, it was far beyond human medical technology. By the end of the first week, he could sit up. By the second, he could walk with support. Communication came slowly. She retrieved a translator device from his fighter's wreckage, risking patrols to get it. The device was damaged, glitching frequently, but it was enough. He learned her name was Lyxara, and she was a princess of the Veros people. He learned that her species had been conquered by the Crithians 70 years ago, that they lived as subjects in their own world, forbidden from practicing their warrior traditions or accessing their own advanced technology. Zarin told her about Earth, about the colonies humanity had lost, about the billions dead in a war they never wanted. He told her about the desperate fight for survival against an enemy that seemed unstoppable. He did not tell her about himself, about the shadow that followed him everywhere. As the third week began, something shifted between them. Like Sarah showed him the forbidden combat forms of her people, ancient techniques she practiced in secret. Zarin, in return, taught her human tactics and strategies. They sparred in the cave, their movements creating a strange new dance that blended two worlds' worth of warrior knowledge. One evening, as they rested after training, like Sarah asked him why he fought. Zarin considered lying, but something about her deserved truth. He told her about growing up in military academies, about being forged into a weapon from childhood, about carrying a burden he could never escape. He still did not tell her everything. The Veros princess studied him with those penetrating eyes, and said something the translator rendered as understanding beyond words. She told him about watching her people's spirits slowly crushed under Crithian rule, about the rage that burned in her chest every day, about feeling powerless while her world died by degrees. They were different species from different stars, but in that moment they recognized something fundamental in each other. That night, as Zarin slept, he dreamed of his father's face. Cold, calculating, cruel. He woke with a start to find like Sarah watching him with concern. The translator glitched, but he caught the word for nightmare. He nodded. On the 21st day, Zarin made contact with human resistance cells operating in the sector. They could extract him, but it would be risky. The Crithians had flooded the system with warships, searching for something. Searching for him, probably. One human soldier was not worth this much attention, which meant they suspected who he really was. As he prepared his gear for extraction, like Sarah helped him check the damaged armor he had arrived in. She was removing the chest piece when her fingers found the scars on his back. Zarin felt her hands stop moving, felt the quality of silence change in the cave. He did not need to turn around to know what she had found. The scars formed a distinctive pattern, surgical and deliberate. They were marks left by Crithian genetic modification, a signature as unique as a fingerprint. Like Sarah had seen these marks before on Crithian shock troops, their elite warriors enhanced beyond natural limits. The translator crackled as she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. The device rendered her words as a question and an accusation combined. "What is this? What are you?" Zarin stood slowly, not turning to face her. For 21 days she had saved him, healed him, trained with him, and trusted him. Now she deserved the truth, no matter what it cost. He told her about Supreme Warmaster Chrysoth, the architect of humanity's suffering and the mind behind the Crithian war machine. He told her about the human colony ships that disappeared 26 years ago, about the genetic laboratories where Crithian scientists tried to create hybrid warriors by combining human and Crithian DNA. He told her about the experiments, the failures, the Chinese letter BODIES of colonists who did not survive the process. Then he told her about himself, the only viable offspring. Raised in a war lab until he was 7 years old, trained to be a living weapon, a bridge between species that the Crithians could use to infiltrate and destroy human worlds from within. He told her about the human special forces raid that freed him, about the childhood spent in military custody, while Earth's leaders debated whether he was a rescued victim or a Crithian sleeper agent. He told her about growing up under constant surveillance, about proving his loyalty 1,000 times over, about the nickname that followed him through every academy and assignment, the enemy's son. He told her about volunteering for the most dangerous missions because he had to be twice as brave, twice as skilled, twice as loyal as anyone else just to be seen as barely trustworthy. When he finished, the cave was silent except for the soft glow of fungi and the distant drip of water. Zarin finally turned to face like Sarah. She stood with her hand on her weapon, her expression unreadable. The translator sparked and died. They stood in silence, two warriors from different worlds, separated now by a truth too large for words. Zarin made no move toward his own weapon. If she decided to kill him, he would not fight her. Perhaps he had always known it would end this way. Then the cave exploded. Crithian soldiers breached from 3 directions simultaneously, their weapons lighting the darkness with plasma fire. They had been tracking like Sarah, suspicious of her frequent disappearances and the time she spent away from the settlement. The timing was coincidental and terrible. In the chaos, Zarin saw a Crithian commander scanning him with advanced equipment. The creature's mandibles spread in what might have been surprise or triumph. It immediately began broadcasting on all frequencies, and Zarin knew what it was reporting. His genetic markers were unmistakable. The War Master's lost hybrid was alive. He grabbed his weapon and fired, dropping the commander, but more soldiers poured in. There were too many. Zarin fought with everything he had, but he was backing toward a corner with no escape. Then Lyxara was beside him, her blades singing through the air in the forbidden forms of her people. She fought like liquid violence, every movement precise and deadly. She cut down Crithian soldiers who had oppressed her people for 70 years, and she did it while broadcasting the entire encounter on every Veros resistance channel she could access. Her translator had been damaged in the first explosion, so Zarin could not hear what she was saying, but he could see it in her eyes. She had made her choice. They fought back to back, human tactics and Veros blade work combining into something the Crithians had never encountered. They cleared a path to the cave's rear exit, a passage like Lyxara had shown him days ago. As they ran through the underground tunnels, Zarin could hear reinforcements arriving above. The entire Crithian occupation force was mobilizing. They emerged in a clearing where Zarin had arranged his extraction coordinates. The stealth corvette dropped from orbit right on schedule, its weapons blazing to cover their approach. As they ran for the boarding ramp, Lyxara looked back at her world one final time. Everything she had known was behind her. Everything she had been was gone. She was now a traitor to the empire that enslaved her people, and she could never return home. But something else was happening across Veros Prime. Her broadcast had reached every settlement, every resistance cell, every Veros who still remembered what freedom felt like. They had seen their princess fight alongside a human, had seen her defy the invincible Crithians. And across the planet, in hidden places, the Veros people began to rise. The stealth corvette jumped to faster than light travel, carrying them away from Veros Prime toward human-controlled space. Zarin and Lyxara stood in the observation deck, watching the alien world fade into the stars. Neither of them spoke. There was too much to say and no words adequate to say it. Behind them, on Veros Prime, the first true rebellion in 70 years had begun. And across the galaxy, in a fortress command ship, Supreme War Master Chrysoth received the transmission that would change everything. His son, his failed experiment, his greatest shame was alive, and he had allied himself with an alien princess whose very existence threatened the Empire's control over subjugated species. The war was about to become something far more personal than either side had ever imagined without short heading 0530. The broadcast that Lyxara sent during their desperate fight had spread like wildfire across subjugated worlds. A princess of a conquered species fighting alongside a human warrior, defying the supposedly invincible Crithian Empire, had become the spark that ignited a revolution no one saw coming. Zarin stood in the command center of the Coalition base, watching tactical displays that showed resistance movements on 17 different worlds. Each one had been inspired by what happened in that cave on Veros Prime. The message was simple and powerful. If a Veros princess and a human soldier could stand together against the Crithians, then perhaps unity among conquered species was not just possible but necessary for survival. Lyxara entered the room, and conversations stopped as they always did when she appeared. She had become something more than a refugee princess. The Veros people had declared her their leader in exile, and 3 other species had offered her similar positions of respect. She wore armor now, a combination of human tactical gear and traditional Veros design, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had found her true purpose. Human command had been skeptical at first. An alien princess with no military record suddenly appearing at their doorstep alongside Zarin, who they already viewed with suspicion, seemed too convenient. But Lyxara had proven herself repeatedly. She understood Crithian tactics from living under their rule. She knew the politics of subjugated species, and she possessed a natural talent for diplomacy that helped forge alliances between worlds that had never trusted each other before. Together, Zarin and Lyxara had created something unprecedented. A multi-species coalition that blended human tactical innovation with the diverse combat techniques of freed worlds. They trained mixed units where humans fought alongside Veros warriors, where tactics from a dozen different cultures merged into new strategies the Crithians had never encountered. But their success had drawn attention from the one person Zarin had hoped to avoid forever. Supreme Warmaster Kryzoth had become obsessed with his son. Intelligence reports showed the Warmaster personally leading fleets to crush rebellion worlds, leaving scorched planets as messages. He had placed a galaxy-wide bounty on Zarin and Lyxara, not for their deaths but for their capture. He wanted them alive. Zarin understood why. His father had spent decades building an empire based on Crithian supremacy, on the doctrine that other species were inherently inferior and destined for subjugation. Now his own hybrid son was proving that cooperation between species could defeat Crithian military might. Every victory the coalition achieved undermined everything Kryzoth had built. The latest intelligence made everything worse. Spy networks reported that the Crithians were constructing a superweapon on a fortress world called Dakros. The weapon could sterilize entire planets, turning them into lifeless rocks. The Crithians planned to use it on rebellion worlds as the ultimate demonstration of power. Billions would die, and the resistance movements would collapse in terror. The coalition had no choice. They had to strike first, but Dakros was the most heavily defended position in Crithian space. Direct assault would cost thousands of lives with minimal chance of success. They needed another approach, and Zarin knew he was the key to that approach. His genetic signature would allow him to bypass Crithian security systems. He could infiltrate the command networks, disable the superweapon, and sabotage the defense grid from inside. It was suicide, but it was also their best chance. Zarin volunteered immediately, and the coalition leadership reluctantly agreed. Lyxara refused to accept the plan. They argued for hours in private, their words heated even through translation devices they had learned to rely on. She told him he was being stupid, that sacrificing himself would not erase his father's sins, that the coalition needed him alive. He told her that his genetic curse was finally useful for something good, that he could save billions, that this was the only way to prove he was not his father's son. Finally, Lyxara said something that made him stop. She reminded him that she had saved his life once before, not because of who his father was or what side of the war he represented, but because she saw worth in him as an individual. She told him that throwing that life away now would make her initial choice meaningless. And she told him that if he was going into that fortress, he was not going alone. The mission launched 3 days later. A massive coalition fleet attacked Dakros from multiple vectors, drawing Crithian forces into a chaotic battle across the star system. While the fleets engaged, a stealth transport carrying Zarin, Lyxara, and a hand-picked squad of elite soldiers from 4 different species slipped through the chaos toward the command ship at the system's center. Zarin's genetic markers worked perfectly. Security systems recognized him as authorized personnel, doors opened automatically, and automated defenses ignored their presence. They moved through the massive vessel like ghosts, heading toward the central control core where the superweapon could be disabled. Everything went too smoothly. Zarin realized it seconds before the trap closed. Blast doors slammed shut throughout the ship, separating him from Lyxara and the squad. Emergency bulkheads sealed corridors. The entire infiltration had been expected, planned for, and now he was alone in a corridor leading to his father's throne room. The doors at the corridor's end opened, and Zarin had no choice but to walk through them. The throne room was enormous, decorated with trophies from conquered worlds. Banners from destroyed civilizations hung from the ceiling. Weapons from defeated species lined the walls. And sitting on a throne made from the hulls of destroyed ships was Supreme Warmaster Kryzoth. Zarin had not seen his father since he was 7 years old, but he would have recognized him anywhere. Kryzoth was massive even for a Crithian, his exoskeleton enhanced with cybernetic implants that gleamed in the dim light. His 4 eyes studied Zarin with an expression that might have been satisfaction or contempt. The Warmaster spoke in perfect human language, his translator rendering the harsh Crithian sounds into words Zarin could understand. He talked about vision and destiny, about creating a galaxy unified under Crithian perfection. He explained that Zarin had been designed as a bridge between species, a living proof that Crithian genetics were superior and could improve lesser races through assimilation. Kryzoth offered Zarin a choice: join him, embrace his true heritage, and together they would reshape the galaxy. The coalition would be absorbed peacefully, species would be elevated through Crithian guidance, and the war would end with Zarin as the symbol of unity. The alternative was watching everything he had built with Lyxara burn as the superweapon annihilated rebellion worlds one by one. Zarin listened to it all. Then he responded with words that had been building in him for 26 years. He told his father that he had not created a bridge between species, but a weapon without conscience. He said that Lyxara had taught him what Chrysoth never could, that being strong meant protecting the weak, not dominating them. He said that unity built on conquest was just slavery with better propaganda. Then Zarin raised his weapon and fired. The fight that erupted was brutal beyond description. Chrysoth was enhanced with decades of military augmentation, experienced from hundreds of battles, and utterly ruthless. But Zarin fought with something his father could never understand. He fought for every species his father had crushed, for every world scarred by Crithian ambition, and for the princess who had saved him when she had every reason to let him die. Zarin used human tactics, shifting and unpredictable. He used Veros blade techniques that Lyxara had taught him in a cave 6 months ago. He channeled rage and pain and hope into every movement, and slowly he began to gain ground against the monster who created him. Meanwhile, Lyxara and her squad were fighting their own desperate battle. They had been cut off from Zarin, surrounded by Crithian elite guards and taking heavy casualties. But Lyxara fought like a force of nature, her blade work overwhelming even enhanced soldiers. She had not come this far to lose Zarin to his father's schemes. They blasted through 3 security doors, fighting every meter, leaving a trail of disabled Crithian soldiers behind them. When they finally breached into the throne room, they found Zarin standing over his father's fallen form, both of them bleeding and exhausted. But Chrysoth was not finished. With his final strength, he triggered a dead man's switch. Displays throughout the throne room lit up showing the superweapon activating, targeting coordinates locked on coalition home worlds. The weapon would fire in minutes, and there was no way to stop it remotely. The only override required Chrysoth's biometric signature maintained continuously while manually disabling the firing sequence. Lyxara understood immediately what this meant. They needed Chrysoth alive. If he died, billions would die with him. But keeping him alive meant he could never face justice for his crimes. She looked at Zarin and saw the conflict in his eyes. This was the monster who had created him as a weapon, who had tortured colonists in genetic experiments, who had orchestrated the deaths of billions. And now they had to save him. Zarin raised his weapon, aimed at his father's head, and for 3 heartbeats the future of the galaxy hung in balance. Then Lyxara stepped forward and placed her hand on his arm. She spoke softly, and her translator rendered words about choosing who they wanted to be rather than accepting who others made them. She told him about an ancient Veros technique, a forbidden art that could place a subject in permanent biological stasis. The person would remain alive, all biological functions active enough to maintain biometric signatures, but frozen in time and awareness. It was considered a fate worse than death among her people, reserved for the worst criminals in their history. Zarin lowered his weapon and nodded. Lyxara performed the technique with precise movements, and Chrysoth's body locked into stasis. His biosignature remained active, which allowed them to access the override systems and disable the superweapon with seconds to spare. The battle in space turned when the superweapon failed to fire. Crithian forces, witnessing their Supreme Warmaster's defeat and capture, began to fracture. Some units surrendered, others retreated into deep space. The Empire's aura of invincibility shattered like glass. Coalition forces secured Dacros and captured enough Crithian technology to shift the war's balance permanently. More importantly, they had proven that subjugated species fighting together could defeat the Empire that had seemed unstoppable. In the aftermath, Zarin stood before his father's stasis pod in the Coalition brig. Chrysoth was frozen mid-scream, his expression locked in eternal rage. Alive but unable to harm anyone, unable to speak or act or influence events. Justice of a sort, though it felt hollow. Lyxara joined him, and they stood together in silence. 6 months ago, they had been strangers from enemy species meeting by chance in a forest. Now they were partners who had changed the course of galactic history. The translator rendered her question simply, "What happens now?" Zarin looked at the tactical displays showing liberated worlds, at the coalition ships from 20 different species patrolling together, at the future they had fought so hard to create. He told her they would finish what they started. They would free every world still under Crithian control. They would prove that the galaxy's future belonged to cooperation, not conquest. 6 months later, the coalition had liberated 12 more worlds. Zarin and Lyxara led joint operations, their partnership now legendary across freed space. They had become proof that different species could not just coexist but thrive together. On Veros Prime, now completely free of Crithian occupation, monuments rose honoring the princess who chose compassion over safety and the warrior who chose character over heritage. Children from a dozen species learned their story in schools. The alien princess who saved a human warrior, and together they sparked the war that freed the galaxy. The Crithian Empire still existed, but it was shrinking as more worlds broke free every month. And at the edge of its territory, Zarin and Lyxara prepared for the next operation, knowing that every freed world brought them closer to a future worth fighting for. The war had been raging for 18 months since the fall of Dakros, and the galaxy was unrecognizable from what it had been before. Zarin watched the holographic display in the Coalition war room, showing a map of territories that shifted daily as more worlds broke free from Crithian control. What had started with one princess and one soldier in a cave had become a movement that spanned 30 star systems. But victory was bringing new problems that no one had anticipated. The freed worlds were fractured, each species carrying decades or centuries of grievances against their former oppressors, and sometimes against each other. The Crithians had deliberately fostered these divisions, setting conquered species against one another to prevent unified resistance. Now that the common enemy was retreating, old hatreds were surfacing. Lyxara spent most of her time mediating disputes between species who viewed each other with suspicion. The Veros and the Talrex had ancient territorial conflicts that predated Crithian conquest. The Henari refused to work with the Quiloth due to religious differences. 3 liberated worlds had already erupted into civil war over who would govern after Crithian forces withdrew. The coalition that had seemed so strong during the fight for freedom was fracturing now that freedom had actually arrived. Zarin saw the exhaustion in Lyxara's face during their rare private moments. She carried the weight of being a symbol for too many people, expected to have solutions for problems that had existed for generations. He understood that burden intimately. They had become legends, but legends were not supposed to be tired or uncertain or afraid of failing the people who believed in them. The situation deteriorated further when intelligence reports revealed a disturbing pattern. Crithian forces were not simply retreating randomly. They were consolidating around a specific region of space, fortifying positions around their ancient homeworld of Crythia Prime. Satellite imagery showed massive construction projects, weapons platforms being built, and fleet concentrations that dwarfed anything the Coalition had faced before. The Crithian Empire was preparing for a final stand, and if the Coalition could not hold together long enough to face it, everything they had won would be lost. The Empire would rebuild, reconquer divided worlds one at a time, and the cycle of oppression would begin again. Worse than before, because this time the Crithians would ensure no rebellion could ever rise again. An emergency coalition summit was called on the neutral station of Vesper's Rest. Representatives from 32 freed species gathered in a chamber designed to accommodate vastly different physiologies. Zarin and Lyxara stood before them, aware that the coalition's survival depended on what happened in this room. The meeting descended into chaos within an hour. The Veros delegation demanded priority in resource allocation because they had sparked the initial rebellion. The Talrex countered that their military contributions had been greater and deserved recognition. Smaller species felt marginalized by the larger ones. Species who had suffered longer under Crithian rule felt their pain was being ignored by those more recently freed. Zarin watched it all and felt a familiar despair building. These were not evil people. They were traumatized survivors of decades of oppression, each carrying wounds that went deeper than anyone could see. But their inability to look beyond their own suffering was destroying the only chance they had for lasting freedom. Then something unexpected happened. A young Henari representative stood and spoke in a voice that cut through the arguments. She told a story about her grandfather, who had been executed by Crithian authorities for teaching forbidden Henari history to children. But before the Crithians came, her grandfather had fought in a war against the Quiloth, killing many of them and believing it was righteous. She said that her grandfather died full of hatred for two enemies, the Crithians who killed him and the Quiloth he had fought decades before. She said that she had grown up carrying his hatred like an inheritance, believing the Quiloth were monsters who deserved destruction. Then the coalition had formed, and she had fought alongside a Quiloth soldier named Resh, who had saved her life 3 times during the liberation of their shared system. The young Henari looked directly at the Quiloth delegation and said that Resh had died in the final battle, taking wounds meant for her. She said that in his last moments, he had told her about his own grandmother, killed by Henari forces in that same ancient war. He had carried the same hatred she had, the same conviction that the other side was irredeemably evil, and he had died protecting someone his grandmother would have considered an enemy. The chamber fell silent as she finished speaking. She said that they could honor the pain their ancestors suffered, or they could honor the sacrifices their friends had made to free them. But they could not do both. Choosing to nurse old wounds meant betraying everyone who had died building something new. Like Sarah stood and added her voice to the young Henari's words. She spoke about the choice she had made in a cave 18 months ago when she could have let a human soldier die and secured her own safety. She had chosen differently, because she recognized that old categories of enemy and ally were not as important as choosing who she wanted to be in that moment. She told them that the Crithians had ruled by making each conquered species believe they were alone, that cooperation was impossible, that trusting other species was foolish. Every argument happening in this chamber was proving the Crithians right. Every petty grievance elevated above survival was a victory for the empire that had enslaved them all. Zarin spoke last, and his words carried a weight that came from personal experience. He told them about being raised as a weapon, about carrying his father's sins, about spending his entire life trying to prove he was not the monster others expected him to be. He said that every species in this chamber had been damaged by Crithian conquest, had been turned into something they were not supposed to be, had absorbed toxins that would take generations to purge. But he also told them about the coalition forces fighting across 30 systems, where humans fought alongside Veros, where former enemies coordinated tactics and saved each other's lives. He told them about mixed crews on coalition ships who had formed bonds stronger than species differences. He said that the future was already being built by ordinary people who had decided that survival mattered more than heritage. The summit continued for 3 more days, but something had shifted. Compromises were reached, resources were allocated more fairly, and mechanisms were established for resolving disputes without fracturing the coalition. It was not perfect, and many representatives returned to their world still harboring doubts, but it was enough to hold the alliance together. 2 weeks after the summit, intelligence provided the information everyone had been dreading. The Crithian consolidation around their homeworld was complete. They had assembled a fleet of unprecedented size and were preparing to launch a massive counteroffensive. The target was Veros Prime, the symbolic heart of the rebellion. If the Crithians could recapture and destroy it, they believed the coalition would collapse in despair. The coalition had a choice. They could defend Veros Prime and risk everything in a single battle, or they could evacuate the planet and wage a prolonged guerrilla war. Like Sarah stood in the command center, looking at her homeworld on the displays, and Zarin saw the agony in her expression. Her people had only been free for 18 months. Abandoning their world now would break something essential in the Veros spirit. But defending it meant committing the entire coalition fleet to a battle they might not win. If they lost, the war was over. If they won but took too many casualties, they would be vulnerable to follow-up attacks. The military calculus was brutal and clear. Evacuation was the smart choice. Zarin watched like Sarah struggle with the decision, knowing that whatever she chose would haunt her forever. Then she made a choice that was neither evacuation nor simple defense. She proposed something audacious that made the military strategists in the room question her sanity. Like Sarah wanted to use Veros Prime as bait. Let the Crithians come, let them commit their forces to the attack, and while they were focused on destroying the symbolic heart of the rebellion, the coalition would strike at Krithia Prime itself. A decapitation strike aimed at the Krithian homeworld, hitting them where they believed themselves invulnerable. The plan was insane and risky and completely dependent on timing. They would leave enough forces at Veros Prime to make the defense look genuine, but the majority of the coalition fleet would make a hidden jump to Krithia Prime. If they could capture or neutralize the Krithian leadership before their fleet could return, the war would end. If they failed or were discovered too soon, both strike forces would be destroyed, and the coalition would cease to exist. Zarin supported the plan immediately, understanding that it was exactly the kind of bold action that had defined their partnership from the beginning. The coalition leadership was divided, with many believing the risk was too great. But ultimately they agreed, swayed by the recognition that defensive warfare against a larger enemy would only delay inevitable defeat. The Krithian fleet arrived at Veros Prime 3 weeks later, exactly as predicted. They came in overwhelming force, thousands of warships against a coalition defense force that was outnumbered 5-1. The battle began with massive bombardments, and Veros defense platforms began exploding under concentrated fire. Sarah remained on Veros Prime, coordinating the defense and broadcasting messages to all coalition forces. She wanted the Krithians to see her there, to believe she would never abandon her homeworld. It was the only way to make the deception work. Zarin commanded the strike force heading to Krithia Prime, leading the largest fleet action in coalition history. The jump to Krithia Prime took 6 hours, during which time Zarin received constant updates from Veros Prime. The defense was holding but taking devastating casualties. Cities were burning. Defense platforms were falling one by one. Sarah's broadcasts were becoming more desperate as the Krithian fleet pushed deeper into the system. When the coalition strike force emerged at Krithia Prime, they found minimal defenses. The Krithians had truly committed everything to the attack on Veros Prime, believing their homeworld was beyond the coalition's reach. It was a fatal miscalculation born of arrogance and contempt for species they still considered inferior. The battle for Krithia Prime lasted 8 hours. Coalition forces targeted command centers, communication hubs, and government facilities with precision strikes. They disabled defense networks and captured key installations. Most importantly, they broadcast their attack across every channel, ensuring the Krithian fleet at Veros Prime knew their homeworld was under attack. The Krithian response was predictable. Their fleet abandoned the assault on Veros Prime and made emergency jumps back to defend their homeworld. But the journey took hours, and in that time, coalition forces established complete control over Krithia Prime's orbital space. When the Krithian fleet arrived, they found their homeworld held hostage. Zarin opened communication channels to the Krithian fleet commander, an admiral named Zeth who had been one of Kryzoth's most loyal subordinates. The conversation was broadcast across the entire galaxy, ensuring every species could hear what happened next. Zarin did not demand surrender or threaten genocide. Instead, he offered a choice. The Krithians could continue fighting until their homeworld was destroyed and their species faced extinction, or they could accept that the age of empire was over. He proposed a conditional peace. Krithian forces would withdraw from all occupied territories, war criminals would face justice, and Krithia Prime would be integrated into the coalition as an equal member species, not a ruler. Admiral Zeth responded with outrage and defiance, calling the terms humiliating and unacceptable. But other voices began emerging on Krithian communication channels. Military officers who were tired of war, civilians who feared for their world. Politicians who recognized that continuing to fight would mean extinction for their species. The internal Krithian debate played out over public channels for 3 days while both fleets held position in a tense standoff. Zarin authorized no hostile actions, knowing that patience was more powerful than weapons at this moment. He wanted the Krithian people to choose peace themselves rather than having it forced upon them through total defeat. On the 4th day, Admiral Zeth's second-in-command performed what humans would call a mutiny and what Krithians would call restoring sanity. She arrested the admiral and opened negotiations with the coalition. Not a surrender, but an acknowledgement that the war had become unwinnable, and continuing it served no one's interests. The Treaty of Krithia Prime was signed 6 weeks later. It was imperfect and left many issues unresolved, but it ended the active warfare that had consumed the galaxy for nearly 2 decades. Crithian forces withdrew from occupied worlds, though they retained their homeworld and a handful of core systems. War crimes tribunals were established, though many perpetrators would never face justice. Reparations were negotiated, though nothing could truly compensate for the suffering inflicted. Zarin returned to Veros Prime, where reconstruction was already beginning. The planet had been badly damaged during the battle, but it had survived. Sarah met him at the spaceport, and they stood together looking at the scarred but free world around them. They had done what seemed impossible. 2 people from enemy species had sparked a revolution that freed dozens of worlds and ended a war that everyone believed would last forever. But standing in the ruins of Veros Prime's capital city, they both understood that the hardest work was just beginning. Building a lasting peace would be more difficult than winning the war. Helping traumatized species heal and learn to trust each other would take generations. Preventing new conflicts from erupting as old power structures collapsed would require constant vigilance. And integrating former enemies like the Crithians into a new galactic order would test everyone's commitment to the principles they had fought for. But as Zarin and Sarah walked through the reconstruction sites, seeing humans working alongside Veros, seeing former enemies from a dozen species cooperating to rebuild what war had destroyed, they felt something that had been absent during the long years of fighting. They felt hope. The story that began in a cave with a princess saving a wounded soldier had become the foundation for a new galactic civilization. It was fragile and uncertain and imperfect, but it was real. And every day, ordinary people across dozens of worlds were choosing to build something better than what had existed before. Zarin looked at Sarah and asked if she ever regretted her choice that day in the forest, when she could have let him die and avoided all the pain and responsibility that followed. Sarah smiled and told him that she regretted many things about how the last 2 years had unfolded, but saving his life was not one of them. They returned to their quarters in the temporary coalition headquarters, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and crises. But tonight they could rest, knowing that they had changed the galaxy forever and proven that enemies could become allies, that different species could build something together, and that sometimes one person's choice could spark a revolution that freed billions. The future remained uncertain, but it belonged to them now to shape and build and protect together. 3 years after the Treaty of Krithia Prime, the galaxy was learning what peace actually meant, and the lessons were harder than anyone expected. Zarin sat in the council chamber on the newly established capital station of Unity's Hope, watching representatives from 47 species argue over trade regulations. It was boring, bureaucratic work that made him miss the clarity of wartime when enemies were obvious and objectives were clear. Sarah had warned him this would happen. She had told him that governing was infinitely more complex than fighting, that building institutions was slower than destroying them, and that people who had united against a common enemy would immediately start fighting each other once that enemy was gone. He had not truly believed her until he spent 6 months mediating disputes about mining rights and shipping lanes. But the real challenge was not the bureaucracy. It was the Crithians themselves. The treaty had granted them membership in the coalition as equals, but 3 years was not enough time to erase centuries of imperial arrogance or decades of war crimes. Many Crithians still believed their species was inherently superior, destined to rule, and that the treaty was a temporary humiliation they would eventually overcome. Many former subjects believed the Crithians could never change and wanted them excluded from the coalition entirely. Zarin understood both perspectives intimately. He carried Crithian genetics in every cell of his body, a permanent reminder that species identity was more complicated than simple categories of good and evil. But he also carried memories of human colonies burned by Crithian warships, of friends killed by Crithian soldiers, of the casual cruelty that had defined the Empire's rule. The current crisis involved a Crithian military officer named Commander Vexler, who had been identified as responsible for civilian massacres on 3 worlds during the war. War crimes tribunals had issued an arrest warrant, but Vexler had fled to a Crithian colony world where local authorities refused to surrender him. The Crithian government claimed they were handling the matter internally, but months had passed with no action taken. Former victim species were outraged, demanding that coalition forces arrest Vexler by force if necessary. Crithian representatives threatened to withdraw from the coalition if their sovereignty was violated. The fragile peace that had cost so much to achieve was fracturing over one war criminal's fate. Like Sarah had been working diplomatic channels for weeks, trying to find a compromise that would satisfy justice while preserving the coalition. But she was running into the fundamental problem that neither side trusted the other enough to accept any solution the opposition proposed. The victim species believed Crithians were protecting their own. The Crithians believed they were being singled out for collective punishment. Zarin received an encrypted message during the council session that changed everything. Intelligence operatives had located Vexler hiding in a remote facility on the Crithian colony world. More importantly, they had discovered evidence that Vexler was not simply hiding, but actively organizing. He was recruiting former military officers who rejected the treaty, building a network of Crithian supremacists who believed the empire should be restored by force. The choice was impossible. If coalition forces moved against Vexler without Crithian government approval, it would validate every fear that the treaty was just another form of subjugation. But if they waited for Crithian authorities to act, Vexler might escape, and his supremacist network could grow into a serious threat. Either choice could destroy the coalition. Zarin brought the intelligence to Sarah in her private office after the council session ended. She studied the reports in silence, her expression revealing the weight of impossible decisions. Finally, she told him they needed to try something that had never been done before. They needed to go to Krithia Prime themselves and speak directly to the Crithian people. The idea was dangerous on multiple levels. Zarin was the son of their disgraced war master, a living symbol of Crithian genetic experiments that had violated human rights. Sarah was the princess whose rebellion had destroyed their empire. Together, they represented everything many Crithians hated about the new galactic order. But Sarah argued that avoiding Krithia Prime would only reinforce the perception that they viewed Crithians as irredeemable enemies rather than potential partners. The coalition leadership opposed the visit, citing security concerns and diplomatic risks. But Zarin and Sarah had learned long ago that sometimes the most important actions were the ones everyone advised against. They announced they would visit Krithia Prime to address the Vexler situation directly, and they did it publicly so backing down would be impossible. The journey to Krithia Prime took 4 days, during which intelligence reports painted an increasingly concerning picture. Vexler's network was larger than initially believed, with cells on multiple Crithian worlds. He was not just organizing supremacists, but actively preparing for armed resistance against coalition authority. The war might have officially ended 3 years ago, but for people like Vexler, it had never stopped. When their ship entered Krithia Prime's orbit, they were met by a Crithian diplomatic vessel. The reception was cold and formal, with none of the warmth that typically accompanied official visits. Crithian officials made clear they viewed this visit as an intrusion, a reminder that their homeworld was no longer entirely their own. The first meeting was with the Crithian Council of Elders, the governing body that had replaced the military dictatorship after the war. The elders were an interesting mix of former imperial officials who had accepted the new order and younger Crithians who had opposed the empire even before its defeat. But they were united in their defensiveness about the Vexler situation. Sarah spoke first, her words carefully chosen to acknowledge Crithian sovereignty while making clear that justice could not be indefinitely delayed. She explained that former victim species were watching how this situation was handled, that many saw it as a test of whether Crithians genuinely accepted accountability for war crimes or still believed themselves above galactic law. The response from the Elder Council was defensive and evasive. They talked about cultural differences in justice systems, about the complexity of determining individual guilt in military operations, about the difficulties of arresting a war hero who still commanded loyalty among certain populations. Everything they said was technically true, but missed the fundamental point that justice delayed was justice denied. Zarin listened to the circular arguments until he could not remain silent anymore. He stood and did something he had never done publicly before. He spoke about his father, about Supreme Warmaster Kryzoth frozen in permanent stasis in a coalition prison. He talked about growing up knowing his genetic heritage came from a monster responsible for billions of deaths, about the temptation to make excuses and rationalize, about the daily choice to be defined by actions rather than ancestry. He told the Crythian elders that he understood their position more than they knew. Kryzoth was his father, and part of him would always carry that connection. But he had learned that honoring that connection did not mean protecting it from consequences. It meant acknowledging the harm done, accepting responsibility, and working to ensure it never happened again. The chamber fell silent after Zarin finished speaking. Then one of the younger elders, a female named Sharix who had lost family members to Kryzoth's purges of internal dissent, spoke for the first time. She said that many Crythians wanted to believe the Empire's crimes were committed by a few individuals like Kryzoth, that ordinary Crythians were victims too, that they should not be held accountable for following orders. But Sharix said this was a comforting lie that prevented real healing. She said that she had served in the military during the war, that she had participated in operations she now recognized as atrocities, and that claiming innocence because she followed orders was moral cowardice. She called for Vexler's immediate arrest and for Crythia Prime to establish truth and reconciliation processes that would force their species to confront what they had done. The council erupted in arguments, with older elders accusing Sharix of betraying Crythian dignity and younger members supporting her call for accountability. The debate raged for hours, revealing deep divisions within Crythian society that the surface appearance of unity had concealed. Sarah and Zarin left the council chambers knowing they had not achieved a breakthrough, but had at least forced honest conversation. The visit was scheduled to last 3 days, with public appearances and facility tour designed to show coalition observers that Crythian society was genuinely changing. But on the second day, everything went wrong. Zarin was touring a Crythian military academy, speaking to young officer candidates about coalition operations, when the attack came. Vexler's network had infiltrated the security detail, and suddenly the building was in lockdown with armed supremacists controlling key positions. It was not an assassination attempt, but a hostage situation designed to make a political statement. The supremacists broadcast their demands across Crythia Prime's communication networks. They wanted the coalition to leave Crythian space, wanted all war crimes tribunals dissolved, and wanted the restoration of Crythian military sovereignty. In exchange, they would release their hostages, which included Zarin, Sarah, and 30 Crythian officer candidates who had been attending the event. Coalition forces prepared for a rescue operation, but Sarah convinced them to wait. She recognized that how this situation resolved would determine the future of Crythian integration into the coalition. If coalition forces stormed the building, it would validate supremacist claims that the peace was just occupation by another name. But if Crythians resolved it themselves, it would demonstrate genuine commitment to the new order. Inside the building, Zarin and Sarah were separated from each other, but could hear what was happening through the facility's intercom system. Vexler himself was present, and he used the intercom to deliver speeches about Crythian glory and the shame of accepting defeat from inferior species. His words were designed to inspire support among Crythians listening across the planet. But something unexpected started happening. The Crythian officer candidates who were also hostages began pushing back against Vexler's rhetoric. These were young Crythians who had grown up during the war's final years, who had seen the Empire collapse, who had been educated in the new system that emphasized cooperation over conquest. They did not share Vexler's nostalgia for imperial glory. One young candidate named Thexel spoke directly to Vexler over the intercom, his words broadcast across the planet. He said that his generation had inherited the consequences of decisions made by people like Vexler. They had watched their homeworld nearly destroyed, had seen their species reduced from rulers to equals, and had spent 3 years rebuilding relationships with species their parents had oppressed. Thexel said that Vexler claimed to defend Crythian honor, but there was no honor in refusing accountability. He said that true strength meant admitting mistakes and working to correct them, not hiding behind excuses about following orders or protecting cultural identity. He called Vexler a coward who preferred violence to the hard work of building something better. Outside the building, thousands of Krithians had gathered, not to support Vexler but to oppose him. They were ordinary citizens who had accepted the new order, who were tired of war and supremacy rhetoric, who wanted their species to have a future in the coalition. They surrounded the building, blocking any escape routes, and demanded that Vexler surrender. Zarin listened to all of this from the room where he was being held, and realized something profound was happening. The Krithian species was having a public reckoning with its own history, and the outcome would determine whether genuine change was possible or whether the supremacist ideology was too deeply rooted to overcome. Vexler must have realized he was losing the political battle because he decided to escalate. He announced that he would execute one hostage every hour until his demands were met, starting with Zarin. The symbolism was obvious. Killing the son of Chrysoth, the hybrid who led coalition forces, would be the ultimate act of supremacist defiance. Zarin was brought to the central atrium where Vexler had set up cameras to broadcast the execution across the planet. But before Vexler could carry out his threat, Sarah appeared from a ventilation shaft she had been crawling through for the past 2 hours. She had freed herself using techniques taught to her by Vero's resistance fighters, and she was not alone. She had freed the Krithian officer candidates, and now 30 young Krithians armed with improvised weapons stood behind her. The confrontation that followed was brief but decisive. Vexler's supremacist supporters were outnumbered and surrounded by their own species members who had rejected everything they stood for. When Krithian security forces finally entered the building, they found Vexler and his network already subdued by the hostages they had tried to use as leverage. The incident became a turning point in Krithian society. Sharix used it to push through reforms in the Elder Council, establishing truth and reconciliation processes and strengthening war crimes cooperation with the coalition. Vexler was tried in a Krithian court, but with coalition observers present, and he was convicted based on evidence his own species presented. Zarin and Sarah returned to Unity's hope, knowing that real change had occurred on Krithia Prime. It was not complete and would take generations to fully manifest, but it was genuine. The Krithians had chosen to confront their past rather than hide from it, and that choice made meaningful peace possible. But the visit had also revealed how fragile the coalition remained. Supremacist networks existed among multiple species, not just Krithians. Many former subject species harbored their own supremacist ideologies, believing their suffering gave them moral authority to dominate others. The work of building a truly equitable galactic society was far from complete. 6 months after the Krithia Prime incident, Zarin and Sarah stood before the Coalition Council with a proposal. They wanted to establish exchange programs where young people from different species would live and work together, learning each other's cultures, and building relationships that transcended historical grievances. It was unsexy policy work that would take decades to show results, but they had learned that lasting change came from education and relationships, not treaties and regulations. The proposal passed with broad support, and implementation began immediately. Human students went to study on Vero's Prime. Krithian candidates trained alongside former enemy species. Cultural exchange became coalition policy, and slowly the next generation began seeing each other as individuals rather than representatives of historical enemies. Zarin watched young Krithians working with humans without the baggage of war, and he thought about his father frozen in stasis. Chrysoth had tried to create a bridge between species through genetic manipulation and force. But the real bridge was being built by ordinary people choosing every day to see beyond old categories of us and them. Sarah found him one evening on the observation deck of Unity's Hope, looking at the stars that now represented not conquered territory but potential partners. She asked him if he ever wondered what would have happened if she had not saved him that day in the forest, if she had let the Krithian death squads find him. Zarin told her he thought about it constantly. One choice made by one person had cascaded into galactic transformation. It was terrifying to consider how easily history could have gone differently, how close they had come to outcomes too horrible to imagine. But Sarah reminded him that millions of people had made similar choices over the past 5 years. Soldiers who protected enemy wounded instead of executing them. politicians who chose compromise over vengeance, ordinary citizens who extended friendship across species barriers. Their choice in the forest had been important, but it was only one choice among countless others that had built the coalition. They stood together watching the stars, two people from different worlds who had somehow found each other amid the chaos of war and helped build something worth preserving. The galaxy was still imperfect, still struggling with the aftermath of centuries of conflict, still learning what genuine peace required. But it was their galaxy now, shaped by their choices and the choices of millions of others who refused to accept that old hatreds had to define future possibilities. And every day, in small ways across dozens of worlds, people were choosing to build something better. The story that began with a princess saving an enemy soldier had become the foundation for a new civilization. It would continue long after they were gone, carried forward by generations who would barely remember the war that had once consumed everything. And that, more than any military victory or diplomatic triumph, was the legacy they had truly been fighting for all along.